Hello and welcome. Today we're making one of the easiest desserts and possibly one of the ugliest. Baked apples. They taste amazing, they're super easy to make, and they only use a few ingredients. Once cooked and ready to eat, they do turn into a wrinkly mess. Very tasty, also not very pretty. But we don't mind that because they taste so darn good. So let's get to the ingredients and get started. For our ingredients, we will need 1 apple per person, and for each apple you'll need 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, or a half. Sometimes one's a little too much, and about 2 teaspoons of butter, vegan spread, or coconut fat. All of those worked per apple. You also probably want to have some ice cream to serve it with or heavy cream. Now, this is where you need a tool. Sadly, for a proper baked apple, you're going to need an apple corer. Without an apple corer, it's actually very difficult to safely core an apple. There's ways to do it, but most of them are fairly dangerous as you're pointing knives at your own hands. So, we're not going to be doing that here, but don't worry if you don't have an apple corer. I am working on a recipe to get somewhat of the same effect, but hopefully both better looking and not require an apple corer. So, when we're using our apple corer, you just need to try and line up both sides and push the tool as close to straight between them as you can. Once the first part is out, you're going to need to turn the apple over and just use the coring tool to take out any missed core and parts of the stamen that are left over. You will almost always have a little bit in the middle of where there's some core left over anyway, since it's fairly rare for the core to actually line up between the stem and blossom ends. So once you have all that done and you scraped out the little bits in the center, like the seeds you might see, or anything else that got left over. Now, for each apple, you're going to want to measure out your brown sugar and everything, and you're going to want to mix these very, very well so that it turns into sort of a sandy mixture and everything's going to start to stick together. Now, the reason I say you want to make sure you mix all of this very well is if you are using a full teaspoon of cinnamon with your brown sugar, sometimes the moisture in the brown sugar can cause the cinnamon to clump up, and you definitely don't want anyone with just getting a pocket of straight cinnamon on the tongue, because that is just not pleasant at all. Now, with all of that mixed, we just want to place the apples in a baking dish that is just big enough to fit the apples without them touching. Once you have balanced your apples, if you need to, and you want to gently pack them with the cinnamon and sugar mixture into the former home of the apple core. You'll know when you have enough in there when you have to push down noticeably and apply pressure to pack it in. This usually takes about 3 pushes in my experience, and I know that kind of sounds weird, but when you do it, you'll immediately recognize, like, oh, that's what he's talking about. And as soon as it is packed like that, I just want to take about 2 teaspoons of butter that I'm cutting off with a butter knife. Now, the reason I'm doing it with a butter knife there is not really measuring careful or anything else, is honestly because it looks cooler at the beginning of the baking part. Now, the only thing we have left to do before it goes in the oven is to add about a teaspoon to 2 teaspoons of water, or just enough water to cover the bottom of your pan. You want it to just visually cover it, no more. Anything more than that would be too much water, and you'll end up having to boil some of it off later. And into a oven preheated to 375 degrees for 30 minutes to start we go. This dessert was more or less invented during the Depression from what I know. They didn't really care that it was a mess in the looks department. It was delicious and thankfully didn't cost much. The person who taught me explained it in exactly that way. It was a treat that was affordable. She did joke that during the Depression they never got to have brown sugar in theirs because it was so expensive, so they always had white sugar in theirs. And that now that she could have it, she always makes it with brown sugar. I tried it with white sugar and it's actually perfectly fine. You just lose a little bit of flavor on the sauce end, so if you only have white sugar, don't worry about that. So, back to the subject, one of the main features of this dish and the why you need a pan just big enough to hold your apples is the apples are going to cook down and release their moisture. That, when mixed with the moisture coming out of the brown sugar, will cause a pool of sugar syrup and a bit of the pectin to start forming a thicker sauce you're going to end up pouring over the finished apples and ice cream if you're serving it with that. The butter acts like a fuel to sort of help make this process happen faster, and the fat helps us make sure that not everything evaporates. The sooner the pool forms, the thicker it's going to get over time. And if you have older, softer apples, you may need to add a tiny bit of water halfway through since they're going to release their moisture very quickly, and sometimes that'll cause it to boil away before the dish is done. Now, this boiling is the majority of our flavor forming. As it boils away, it's slowly caramelizing the sugar bit by bit. This is going to give you the wonderful flavor of the sauce, and that is really, truly the star of this show. At the 30-minute mark, we're going to want to check and see if we still have liquid in the bottom of the pan. The liquid should just barely be able to cover the bottom of the pan, so it can kind of be a little bit hard to tell. I thought I needed some on mine and ended up adding 2 teaspoons of water, and that ended up to be just a little bit too much, so my sauce was a tiny bit thinner than I wanted it to be. Once you have your liquid added, if you needed it, it goes back in the oven for another 15 to 20 minutes. If you do add too much liquid like I did, and you do want a thicker sauce, you can always, after the 20 minutes, pour the leftover sauce into a saucepan and boil it down a little bit. In my case, though, since I imagine that if I asked the person who taught me this recipe what to do if my sauce was too thin, she would have promptly replied with, "You eat it, silly." So that's what we did. And with that, one of the easiest and, as mentioned, possibly best examples of ugly delicious you'll ever see. You look and your first thought is, are you really sure it's supposed to look like this? Then the smell hits and is like, okay, no, I'm in. I highly recommend serving this with a small amount of ice cream or heavy cream. The combo of cold and hot just makes the experience that much better. And where you get the patches where the sauce and the cream start mixing, it's just an amazing combo. I highly recommend it that way. So, for those of you still here, thank you for watching and sharing the videos, and if you haven't already subscribed and you enjoyed, subscribe for more like this, but hopefully better looking. As always, have a great day and a great meal.